So this is going to be a first exercise in painting using Tempera paints. We're going to create a value scale and a blended version of the value scale. So what you're going to need is you're going to need some kind of small container of water so you can rinse your brushes out, and then you're going to need some paper towels to dry it off. You're going to need a pencil, and you're going to need, as far as your brushes go, this is a flat. The round ones are more, or the pointy ones. The flats are kind of the squarish looking ones. This one, as far as size goes, is probably about the medium size that came in the pack. The ones brushes I got, so that would work. All right, as far as the paints go, well, let's look at the paper. In the packet of things I gave, as far as paper goes, you had 3 sheets of 9x12 paper. You're going to need 1 sheet of that. Now, as far as how to set up your paints, the paints aren't normally in the container stored in the bag. It's just the way I handed them out conveniently. So you can set those aside for the moment. The plates, 2 plates. One plate's going to act as the bottom plate to hold the paint, and the other one is just going to be flipped over just to sort of to shield or cover the paint as you put it back in the bag in between uses. But you could also use this surface to mix on eventually. Okay, so let's put some paint on this plate. Okay, so I gave a lot of paint, probably more than you need for this assignment. And what you don't want to do is pour all the paint on there. That would be, this paint is very thin, therefore it would move a lot and then it would get all mixed in. So that would just sort of be a waste. So once you remove the lid and set that aside, now a little technique for doing this neatly, I found, is that when you go to pour it so that paint doesn't run down the side, is you can take this brush and wipe it off. So you'll see. So I'm going to pour out just a little. I don't need a lot. Maybe about that much. Now to clean this edge, I just take my brush, wipe it on that edge, and just scrape that back in there, and I don't have any paint dripping down the edge here. Okay. So it makes it really nice and neat. So I'm going to place the lid back on here. Make sure it's sealed all the way. Now I'm getting ready to get the white. I might be able to use the back side of this brush and I have to clean it. Take the top off the white. Pour about the same amount of white. Again, wipe this off. I might have left a little bit of black right there, but it's not getting down in the paint. Got a little bit right there, but it's okay. At least I don't have a big mess running down the side of my container here, which can create a real mess. Be prepared to get some paint on you as you do this. Already got a little bit there. So I hope you've got a fairly good location to do this. Some kind of flat table surface, because now I have these paints. I'm going to need to, I can set this up. Well, actually, let me show you real quick. At the end of this session, what I would do is take this, put it back on top, and put it back in the bag, and then seal it up. I have some students that like to store their brushes in the bag, just conveniently. As far as these containers of paint, don't put those back in there. So this will keep it moist, the paint from drying out, and that's how that system works. Again, Tupperware container could work. I've used those before as well. Actually, I have one right here I can show real quick. This is a set that I took this weekend. Went on a trip, and this is the lid. These are acrylics. So there's my pan of acrylics, and then there's the lid I used to mix on, and I got like a paper towel on the bottom with a piece of tracing paper. Keeps it wet. Learned that little trick online. So that's another potential way you can store your paint. So you know, when you store this, spin the paint, even though there's a little bit in there, if you leave this on a tilted surface, all that paint's going to start to run to one side. So try to store this in some place where it's going to stay flat. So let me get this back out. So I was talking about having space for this. So you know, I got all this stuff. I got paints, and I got my water, paper towel. So you're gonna need a little bit of space to kind of get things kind of spread out in order to do this. All right. So got my paints. And let's look at this piece of paper. Okay. So there's where the pencil comes into play. And we're going to do several things on this piece of paper where I'm going to do demonstrations, and that you'll have to follow along and turn in as well. So I'm just going to take up a small portion of this corner over here for today. And what I'm going to do is create this sort of a bar here. So I'm going to start with, you don't need a ruler necessarily. You can just rough this in, a straight line coming down. Stop about there, come over about an inch or maybe a little over an inch, and that's about 3.5 inches or so. Then we'll start to come up this way, making the other side to this. And then I'm going to start creating these segments. Okay, I need to create 9 segments. We're going to create a 9-step value scale. Okay, so I'm going to come up about a 1/2 inch or so. I'm going to try to make it about the width of that, so I can, or no narrower than that. So that's about a 1/2 inch there. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I'm going to have to put one more section on here. So that's 9. So there's my 9-step value scale that we're going to put our values in. Okay, so let's go ahead and write that over here. 9-step value scale. Okay. Now, generally you number them, and 1 being for white and 9 being for black. So let's do that. Okay. Now, so let's go ahead and just write white up here. Black down here. And this being our sort of mid value, let's just put middle value. Just to designate that. Okay. Okay. So now we're ready to start painting that in. Alright. Now you can look up value scales online. I'm sure you could find plenty. And kind of help you assess your values. But we're going to do this, or I'm going to do it without looking at one. I'm just going to use my best judgment. Now right now I have a mixture of white and black on here, so I need to rinse this off. To rinse your brushes off, I just sort of pounce it on the bottom, kind of stir it around. Take my paper towel and then start wipe it. So you can see I got a little bit right there. Maybe that'll kind of clean off as I'm clean off the sides. Kind of grabbing that. Now it's pretty important to get quite a bit of the moisture out of the brush when you do that, because if the brush is holding a lot of water and moisture every time you clean it, that gets into your paint and will thin it down. And this paint's already fairly thin, so you want to try to get that fairly dry every time you clean it. Alright, so we're going to start with just designating the white, the black we already have, and then try to find the middle value. Okay, so I'm going to take some white here. Now, I know I'm painting white on a white piece of paper, and I will require you to paint the whites on your paper for the whites in your painting. As you'll see here, it does show up. The paper is kind of off-white, whereas this paint is pretty much pure white. Generally, whenever you leave white of the paper as the whites in your painting is for watercolor. Okay, so rinse that off. So I've been doing quite a bit of that repeatedly. Now I'm going to grab some black. Don't have to worry too much about painting within the lines. This is just an exercise, a practice, a chart, or even really a useful tool, really. A lot of value scales you can get that are cut out and that you can then hold up to a picture you're looking at to assess what value things are. So I'd say it's a pretty useful tool. So now I'm going to rinse this off. Well, I think I'll just leave it black on there because I need to mix my gray now. So I already have some black on here. I really kind of need to put some over here though. Let's see if that might be enough. Might want to grab a little more black. So you can use the rest of this surface for your mixing of your paint, okay? And you know, if you run out of space over time, then you can also use the top. All right, so I have some black in my brush. Now, how am I going to get my white? I'm going to just stick it right in the middle of my white palette paint. If I do that, then what will happen is some of this trace of black will end up in that white right there, and there'll be some white underneath that I just won't be able to get to. So that would be pretty wasteful. I always advise students whenever they have something on the brush and they're getting ready to stick it in something else to grab some paint, to take it to the edge. That way if you leave a trace of something, it's just at the edge, and then that way it can be cleaned up and it doesn't hinder the rest of your paint. So let's mix this in. I'm trying to mix a mid-value gray right now, and you would think it's going to take about 50-50, right? And that's a good, theory or idea of how that should work, but paints aren't quite always like that. They mix, they vary. Some pigments, when I say pigments, what's in paint is pigment, the powdered substance that creates it. There's a liquid binder and then there's a pigment. And so white gets generally kind of overpowered, okay? So to make this middle value, I'm probably actually going to need to use more white than black, and right now that's not much white. I may just try to even use the black that's on the brush and not even use that. Let's just see here. So you just trial and error. To mix, it really takes some practice to kind of get an idea, because it's all about proportions, to get something that you want, to dial it in. A little bit more of this, a little less of that, and to kind of really dial it in and tune it to get it where you want it to be. I mean, same could be for anything else like music, bass and treble, for food, salt, pepper, whatever ingredients you are putting in the things. Just a little bit can make a difference. So the same goes for mix and paint. All right, so I'm feeling pretty good about that gray, so let's go ahead and put that down here. It's feeling a little dark right now. But here's the thing about paint. Also, when it's wet, it looks darker. Okay, so if you've ever noticed when after it rains, how trees will look darker, how the road will look darker, and then once it dries, it looks lighter. So that's going to be a thing you kind of have to take in consideration as you're doing this. You're trying to get a certain value, but the value you're looking at isn't necessarily the value you're going to get once it dries. So to speed this up, what I've done before actually is, because otherwise you're just sort of watching paint dry, right? And that can be kind of slow and tedious. So I put it on there kind of thin, so I can already start to see it kind of lighten up right there. So it's starting to dry. It's a little wetter where it's darker. The paper is actually absorbing some of the moisture out of the paint, so it's helping speed up the drying. So if I put it on there really thick, it would take quite a while to dry. But to speed this up, sometimes I've waved the paper, or even I've used a hair dryer, or just so happens I have this piece of poster board right here. I can sit here and kind of fan it off, and that can help speed it up too. Or you might even use your spare plate. Whatever, that'll kind of help you. Now, that's pretty much about dry. So those darker areas are starting to fade out lighter. So, I'm still feeling maybe that's a little too dark. Feels like it feels closer to black than it does to white. So that might even be this value right here. So what I'm going to do, so I'm just going to see that mixture maybe about still a little bit wet, so I think I can mix a little bit more white in that. Let's see if I can still use some of that mixture. The good thing about tempera paint is with making these little mixtures like this, you know it starts to kind of dry. If you take some wet paint and mix into it, it can actually kind of re-wet. Now some of this mixture I'm making, ooh, that's getting pretty light. Since I have quite a bit of it now, I can actually use some of that to make my other values as well. So this is probably going to go on a little thicker. I mix up quite a bit. Let's see if this will kind of a little better gray here. I didn't explain this, why I'm doing this, where I'm not going from white to lightest gray to light gray to like a mid value and then work my way down, or go from black and work my way to white. That usually doesn't work out. Every time I've seen students do that, they'll either work from black or get to white, off the scale, or never reach white, or reach white too quickly. We want each one of these values to look like they're an equal step in value in these 9 steps. If we have too much of a jump, then things aren't quite working out. So I find this way of breaking things up that you're able to get a more accurate way of creating these values, okay, the steps that we need. So what I'm going to do now is I'll work on this value, which is the darkest, the mid dark value. And then I'd work on the sort of this mid light value and break those areas up. So let's wait on this dry a little bit. Let's speed this up, see if I feel better about that value. I think once I have that, that can really help me establish the rest of my values. I'm feeling better about this already. It's starting to, still might be a bit dark, but I think we'll go with that. All right, we'll go with that. So what I'm going to do now is I'll go ahead and work on this dark value. I'm going to use some of this black I have here, and maybe just add it to what's on my brush. And that's just not quite dark enough. Grab a little black. I'm feeling pretty good about that. If this is that, this is next to it, I can kind of judge it. I could probably get a good value in between there to go right there. So let's try this. Makes it pretty thin there. Looks like they don't have a whole lot of paint to put on there. Will just mean it'll dry quicker. And I can judge my value a little better. It's going to dry real fast because I put on there pretty thin. It feels pretty good. Feels like it's a good, comfortable jump. Now, what I'll really be able to tell is when I put these values in here, is the edges that appear. You know, you'll see it in just a minute, and I'll explain that a little more. So let's make this darker, the darkest gray. So it's nearly black. Again, now I'm not rinsing my brush every time I do this because I'm just using what's on the brush actually then to kind of help in creating these mixtures. Now when I jump from these darks to these lights, I'm going to need to rinse it off. And I can see right here, that's quite a value jump right there. That's what I'm talking about, seeing the edge. We can see that edge because of just how much darker this is and how much lighter that is. So now that I can see the edge, and that's what we're trying to do here, is create a distinct change in value. If it was very similar, then we wouldn't see the edge very well. So let's just see how this looks next to black though. If it's too close to black, then I might have to then lighten it up a little bit. Now since I'm not using much paint here, I'm really having to sort of force off my brush. Okay, so let's see how that looks. Kind of dry that off a little bit. Now I can see just from looking on my screen, my computer screen, that what you probably see is this does look fairly similar right now. And we see that edge right there. Let's just see what happens when this dries. Also, you might be getting a little glare, a little bit of reflected light in the paint. But once Tempera paint dries, it really has no glare. It's very matte. It's kind of rough. It doesn't have a sheen to it like acrylics would. So, for some reason it's not showing up on the camera that well. But from what I'm seeing, that does look like a pretty good edge between the black and that gray, that dark gray, and about similar type of contrast at that edge to that value. So that feels like a good step. Okay. All right. So now I'm going to temp this one. Hopefully these values are separate enough that I can create a value in between there and they'll look really good. So I believe this is some of that value that's left over. So I need something that's kind of in between those two. But this is pretty much about dry, so I really can't do much with that. So I'm just using what was on my brush, what was left over, which wasn't much because I'm not mixing up a lot of paint here. I was able to just kind of mix it in with what was fairly dry there. Like I said, when things get kind of dry, you can add something wet to it and it'll start to kind of re-moisten. And that's a quality of tempera paint. You may have seen, actually there's tempera cakes out there where it's like it's like watercolor really, where it's, you know, that you add water to it and it becomes paint. So let's try this. let's try this value and see. I'm feeling like that is just way too dark. So actually it looks darker than that. So this might be a little difficult. Let's just try this. It feels pretty good there, but how does it feel over here? Basically about the same. Of course, it could lighten up when it dries. So some of these you might have to paint and repaint, mix and remix. Now notice how I didn't, when I added some white, mix it into everything. I just added out here to what was on the brush. So I really got a lighter version of it. And then if I need to get it darker, I can push it over this way. So this way I got like this range of values here I'm working with in terms of paint mixtures that I have options to use. Alright, so that's darker than that. Now is it lighter than this? And I think it is. And when it dries, it'll get even lighter. But hopefully it won't dry to about the same value as that. Now I can see from the screen that you're already seeing a little glare on that. You can see how it's wet. And as it starts to dry, it gets less glare on it. Light reflecting off the moisture of it. Put on that one on there a little thicker because I mixed up quite a bit of paint, so it's going to take a little bit longer to dry. I can already see that edge is getting fairly dry, and it really is showing up right there. So I'll be interested to see how that turns out. It might even actually end up being similar to that, which then I'd have to put a little darker value. I feel like those really turned out pretty good. And it does appear to be drying to a similar value of that. So I got too dark, I got too light. So if I can get it just right. Now if it stayed that, so right now it looks similar in value to that. We know it's going to lighten up. And it looks really dark right there, but we know it's going to lighten up. Trial and error. A lot of error. A lot of trial. I already start to see that edge lightening up. Which was a quicker way to do that. A hairdryer. Hairdryer totally speed this up. So if you have a hairdryer, that's something you can use. So I think I'm going to go with this because I think this is probably going to work out. All right. We're just going to let that dry and then we'll see how that turns out right there. So I'm going to move to my lighter values. Okay. All right, so I have a pretty dark value on there right now, and I could actually, rather than rinse it off, and I'll sometimes do this, I'll use some of that dark pigment that's on there to kind of gray I'm going to do this number 3 next. So let's just wipe this off. So I'm wiping off as much of the paint as I can. You don't want to be too forceful into this. I'm kind of squeezing it between my fingers and then pulling the brush through. I don't want to pull the bristles out though. These bristles are held in place by they're glued together, and then also um, kind of crimped in place. This is called the ferrule. That's what holds the bristles to the handle. So sometimes that will give out and the bristles will come out. So you don't want to pull too hard on those bristles. All right, so I'm just there might be enough left on there, even though it doesn't really seem like there's anything on there, to then make this gray. So you'll see what happens. So I'm gonna grab quite a bit of white and then just pounce that around. You'll start to see this turn a little gray. Just because some of the little bit of pigment of that black or gray that was left over, I can use that and to make this gray. So I need something really light. Now, the toughest thing that students have, in my experience in mixing paint, is making lighter values, okay? Most colors are really dark, with the exception of yellow. Yellow is a fairly light color. All the rest of the colors on the color wheel, the color spectrum, are pretty dark, as what we would know as an orange or a blue or a red or a purple are really dark values. So if you're ever going to make a light value of something, you need to start with white being the majority of the mixture. So just know that it's going to take a lot more white. In general, painters, artists who paint buy more white than any other color. And really, white's technically not a color, but than any other amount of pigment they buy, white, generally they're buying twice as much because they're going to end up having to use twice as much white just to get those the lighter values. So, I had just a trace amount of something dark on there, and I scooped up a great amount of white right there just to get this really light value. All right, so let's see if this kind of will fit. Right now it looks pretty dark, but I could be fooled. It's just been wet. And right now that's starting to turn out a lot better. You squint your eyes at this, just as we squint our eyes at, as we're talking about doing value studies. Hopefully I really should start to see these edges. Right now I see a pretty big jump between these values right here. But there is a decent edge showing up between all those. That way I know I did this right. If the values blended together and there was no edge that appeared, then I know the values are too similar. So this is starting to lighten up. There's enough, I'm not really sure. Okay, I could even do this. I do this to sometimes match colors. In this instance, we're trying to find the difference. And I can hold it up to that and see how that looks. Obviously, it looks a lot darker next to that white than it looks lighter against that. So I might should go a little bit lighter. So I'm not going to mix all this into that because, again, I want just to get this really light. So I'm only going to use kind of like the edge. So I'm sort of cutting it in half, I guess you might say. I guess that might be a way to look at it. So I'm pulling some more of it in just because I feel like I got really light. Yeah, I'll go with that. I might end up about the same. So let's put quite a bit of paint on this one, so it's going to take a while to dry. Now I can always paint the other ones and then come back and keep readjusting. Really hoping this is going to turn out like a lighter value, or enough of a lighter value. I'm not really sure about that. So I think I just need to wipe some of that off. Maybe use the pigment that's on there. Mix that in. Surely. I had a professor in college who said some areas of his paintings had 9 layers of paint on it. So what am I up to, like number 4 on this? You can even see that my paper is even starting to kind of buckle right there, I think. We got so much moisture on there. Alright, so we're going to go with that. I'm feeling like that's a pretty good jump now. Now to make this kind of darker value, which was actually kind of what I felt like maybe I had over here, I might be able to re-moisten that a little bit and pull that in. Let's see what that'll do. Feels too dark. This is something that you can do quite often, is create value scales and even paint mixtures, and just to kind of dial in your skills on mixing. As you can see here, I have like a range, almost like a value scale that's like on my palette, and where I'm kind of using, I'll create a new batch and then I'll kind of spread over into another one and kind of pull some of that in just to kind of adjust things to dial it in. Right now that feels very similar, but I'm hoping as this dries, and I see a big value jump right there, that as this dries, I'll start seeing the edge appear there and less of an edge appear there. Which I'm starting to see. So I'm already starting to see a lighter edge appear right there. So I think I've got it. And then right there, over time, I think that's going to whiten up a little bit right there. All right, so Now I think I'm going to have to want to rinse my brush off for this one, okay? Because I need just a trace, a very, very small amount of any kind of gray to get this lightest value. So I'm going to need to rinse my brush off. And even after I rinse this brush off, there might be enough gray left in it that I could use to mix that. Because unless I go to the sink and run it under water and rinse it with soap, then I'll probably get all the pigment out of the brush. Alright, so let's just see if there's anything left in that. When I mix it with this white, I'm picking up a lot of white. Just place it into a new spot on the plate. Just pounce that around a little bit. See if any pigment starts to loosen out of those bristles. And it does look like there is. This is definitely not white anymore. I didn't have to pick up any gray or black. It was just, even though I rinsed this out, there's a little bit of pigment left in it. Now, was it enough? It would be too similar value to the white than it is there. And right now, that looks like a good value. Again, how it dries, we'll see. Now that value, now it's pretty dry. That's looking really good. I really like that edge I see there, the contrast there, the edge I see and the contrast there. And we'll see about this one. Maybe it'll dry lighter. Now being a very light value, with it being wet, let's see what happens. Does it dry lighter? So maybe in the end, I did maybe go a little too light on that. Maybe a little too light on that value. Even though I kept trying to make it lighter and lighter, I might have went a little too light because I see such an edge right there. But right now, with this value scale, I feel like I do see edges, which means there's contrast between these values, means there's differences. I see an edge there. And that is truly how we see our world. We don't see our world through lines and contours. When we draw, we're actually drawing these differences in values of shapes of things. Like if you draw my hand right now, you draw that edge. It's because really I know it's a different color, but it's a different value. Okay? So we see edges through difference in values. Okay? Alright, so with this one, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to do a gradated value scale. And this won't take nearly as long. But what we're going to do is going to attempt to go from a black to a white with the grays in between, but blend them. Okay? So what I'm going to do is just draw another bar, same length, beside of this one. And I'm only going to go maybe a little wider than the width of one of those segments there, or close to it. Okay, so we're going to call this a gradient. Okay, this is a gradient. Alright, so I'll go ahead and rinse this off. I think I'll start with white. Now, gradients are definitely a skill and a technique. We're going to practice more later. This will at least give you some sort of start on it, an introduction into it. So I'm doing is starting with white at the top, bringing some of that paint down. I'm going to start to add some of the grays I already have over here into this. kind of mixing on the paper. And that's how you truly create a gradient and a blend, is when the paint is still wet. That white was down here, and I added a little bit of gray. I had more gray here, then I took and brought some up here, so it thinned out with some of the white that was here. So therefore we see another value that's in between those, therefore creating a gradient. And you can only do that really as long as the paint is wet. Now here's the trick. This paint dries fast. So the paper is working against you, it's drying the paint out. Now I'm trying to create values that are similar to the ones here. Just quickly, hopefully be able to mix it into what I previously had there. Now I'm able to do this pretty quickly because I have this now to go by also. Let's see if that mixes, because it's probably about dry. So I'm making small little brush strokes as I go up, and it's wet enough to where that blended in. Okay, so now I'm going to try if I hope I got enough paint here when I mix this value. Got a little dark on the edges of my brush. A little too dark. Let's see if that mixes. It feels pretty good. Alright. Hopefully I'll remain wet enough where when I mix this in, I might be getting a little too dark here. Notice I'm not talking much because I'm concentrating. And this is, I gotta do this quickly while the paint is still wet. Alright. So right there, I don't feel like I did so well. I see an edge right there. Seeing a pretty good blend of some of the other ones. Maybe not so much right there. Got some glare on it, so I can't hardly make it out. What's going on? It feels a little better. So with this one, you don't see edges. I'm starting to see a little value break in those areas. And all I can do is I can go in and try to dial those back in a little bit. Having the spot kind of treated. Hopefully it works out. Could be messing it up because that area is dry now. Sometimes it's better to leave things alone. It's like you always have to start from scratch again just to perfect it. So I'll leave it at that. If I keep fussing with it, I'll have to keep working with it until I'm completely satisfied with it. But right now that looks like a good gradient. You know, it goes from black to white without any edges really appearing as starkly as these do. The values just, it's almost like I've created another value in between these values, is essentially what you're doing. If you created more values in between these values, you wouldn't see an edge. So if I create another with, And one way to look at this is the way I was approaching this was if this was wet and this was wet, I could just wipe in between and create another value, right? Where I'd kind of mix those together in between. And that's essentially what I'm trying to do here. Is, I'm putting one value next to another value, and then while they're still wet, I'm basically mixing them together. So if this was wet and this was wet, then I could mix it together, right? If the paint was still wet on the surface. And that's the trick, is this stuff dries so fast. So sometimes what I could do, if it dried up on me, I could just mix a gray and then put that gray in between, and then it would kind of look like a gradient, which is what I was having to do here, where the paint had dried, and I was just going in and spot treating it, okay? All right, so this is your value scale, this is your gradient, and at this point, what you would do is you could just put your lid on your paints, rinse your brush off, put your paints back into your bag, and you're done.